From New York, this is Democracy Now!
What does democracy look like? This is what democracy looks like. What does democracy look like? This is what democracy looks like.
President Trump's deployment of federal forces to Portland, Oregon, Seattle, and other cities has sparked a new round of protests across the country. We'll go to Seattle and Portland for the latest. Then we remember civil rights icon Congressman John Lewis.
John never gave up hope. His optimism is what he inspired in all of us. We're all infused with that optimism. Can't you hear him? Find a way to get in the way. Good trouble, necessary trouble.
Dr. Martin Luther King called him the boy from Troy. He was a son of Alabama and a 17-term Congress member from Georgia. On Sunday, a horse-drawn carriage carried Lewis's body over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, where he was almost beaten to death at a voting rights march in 1965, now known as Bloody Sunday. We'll speak with Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude about the legacy of John Lewis, Black Lives Matter, and Glaude's new book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Coronavirus cases continue to surge in much of the United States, where the number of confirmed infections has topped 4.2 million, with nearly 147,000 reported deaths. Florida surpassed New York to become the state with the second highest number of infections after California. The White House Coronavirus Task Force, Dr. Deborah Birx, called Florida, Texas, and California 3 New Yorks. In California, healthcare providers say they're again dealing with shortages in testing, which is hitting low-income and immigrant communities the hardest. In Texas, doctors at a rural hospital in Starr County have received critical care guidelines to help them decide which COVID-19 patients the hospital can treat and those who they send home because they're more likely to die. Southern Texas is now also reeling from Hurricane Hanna, which battered the region Sunday, causing flash flooding and knocking out power lines. Hurricane Hanna also caused major damage in parts of Mexico. Meanwhile, in Puerto Rico, a protest caravan Saturday called for San Juan's International Airport to shut down all non-essential travel as tourists continue to vacation on the island despite rising COVID-19 cases and are often seen not wearing masks or practicing social distancing. This is Ricardo Santos of the Socialist Workers Movement, which organized the protest.
We're not backing down. We're going to continue this caravan and this struggle because this is a life or death situation, and this governor has not been addressing this issue. So as we've done in the past, the people are going to take matters into their own hands.
In immigration news, a federal judge has denied a Trump request to delay today's deadline for releasing immigrant children from family detention centers run by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in Texas and Pennsylvania. The release was ordered due to concerns over rising coronavirus infections. There will be no family separation without parental consent, Judge Dolly G. specified in her order. On Capitol Hill, the Republican-controlled Senate's expected to unveil a $1 trillion proposal today for the long-awaited second coronavirus relief package. The legislation includes another round of $1,200 stimulus checks, according to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, and scraps the $600 weekly boost in unemployment benefits, which Democrats are fighting to extend. Instead, unemployment will cover 70% of lost wages, which will likely amount to approximately $200. Republican senators are also trying to pass Senator Mitt Romney's Trust Act as part of the bill, which would gut Social Security and Medicare. Globally, coronavirus cases have now topped 16.2 million. Last week, the worldwide caseload jumped by 1 million in just 4 days. As European nations scramble to prevent a second wave of infections, Britain has reinstated a 14-day quarantine for travelers coming from Spain. North Korea has locked down a city bordering South Korea and declared a national emergency as the first suspected case of COVID-19 was announced, though outside observers say North Korea may have already had many identified or unreported cases. In the Philippines, thousands of people packed a stadium in the capital, Manila, over the weekend as they awaited mandatory COVID-19 testing before being allowed to return to their hometowns after many lost their jobs during the lockdown. Unemployment in the Philippines has surged to over 17% since the start of the pandemic. Latin America remains one of the worst-hit regions. In Costa Rica, hundreds of Nicaraguans have been stuck at the border after authorities shut down entry into Nicaragua for anyone who's unable to present a negative COVID-19 test, including their own citizens. In Mexico, the health minister of the northern state of Chihuahua has died from COVID-19. In Brazil, the second most affected country with 2.4 million cases, New Year's Eve festivities in Rio de Janeiro have been canceled. The event draws up to 3 million people each year. In Bolivia, where coronavirus cases are still surging, election officials delayed the presidential election for the second time this year, citing the pandemic. Former Bolivian President Evo Morales was ousted last year and replaced by right-wing interim President Janine Áñez. The World Health Organization warned last week COVID-19 is taking a major toll on healthcare professionals across Africa. Over 10,000 health workers across 40 African countries have been infected. Morocco's locked down major cities, including Casablanca, Marrakesh, and Fez, as recent spikes have been reported across the country. Anti-racist protests across the country and the United States this weekend were met with violent police attacks, arrests, and the death of a protester in Austin, Texas. For the 60th day in a row, demonstrators rallied in Portland, Oregon, Sunday. Shortly after midnight this morning, federal officers fired tear gas and other crowd control weapons to disperse a crowd that gathered outside the federal courthouse, which has become a flashpoint of the nightly protests. President Trump's deployment of federal agents to Portland and other cities sparked a new round of protests across the country this weekend. On Thursday, the Trump administration sent a team of federal tactical border officers to Seattle. It remains unclear what role the agents played as Seattle police arrested dozens of protesters and fired flash grenades and pepper spray into crowds. In related news from Seattle, a judge has ordered the Seattle Times and 4 TV stations hand over to the police photos and videos of a protest in May during which windows were smashed and police cars were set ablaze. The police hope the images will help them identify suspects in a move press freedom advocates and reporters warn endangers all journalists. In Austin, Texas, a protester named Garrett Foster was shot dead. Foster's mother said her son was pushing his fiance's wheelchair when a car drove into the crowd and opened fire. On Saturday, 3 people were injured at a Louisville, Kentucky protest over the police killing of Breonna Taylor. The gun fired at this weekend's protest belonged to a member of the armed coalition of mostly black activists known as the Not Effing Around Coalition. The 3 victims were also part of the group. In Aurora, Colorado, authorities are investigating after a car drove through a Black Lives Matter protest. One protester also reportedly fired a weapon at the march. In Chicago, Christopher Columbus statues were taken down from 2 parks after an order from Mayor Lori Lightfoot. One of the statues was in Grant Park, where a police officer last week punched teenage activist Miracle Boyd in the face, knocking out her teeth during a protest to topple the statue. For more on her case, go to DemocracyNow.org. The body of civil rights leader and Georgia Congressmember John Lewis has made one last trip across a bridge in Selma, Alabama, that became a flashpoint in the struggle for racial equality in the Jim Crow South. On Sunday, a funeral caisson drawn by 2 black horses crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, with family members placing red roses on the spot where Lewis was almost beaten to death by police in 1965 while marching for voting rights. This is Fred Lewis speaking at a weekend memorial service for his brother, John Lewis.
I remember the day when John left home. Mother told him not to get in trouble, not to get in the way, and be particular. But we all know that John got in trouble, got in the way, but it was a good trouble. John was different from the rest of the family, and he would have thoughts that all of the troubles he got himself into would change the world.
After his body was taken across the Selma Bridge, he lay in state in the capital of Alabama, in Montgomery. Lewis's body will then lie in state at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., ahead of a funeral in Georgia. Meanwhile, House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn is seeking to rename a major voting rights bill after John Lewis. The legislation, which has already been approved by the House, would restore parts of the Voting Rights Act gutted by a Supreme Court ruling in 2013. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has refused to schedule a debate on the bill. In Hungary, over 70 journalists, almost the entire editorial staff of Index, the country's largest online independent news outlet, resigned Friday following the removal of its editor-in-chief. The news deals a major blow to press freedom in Hungary, which has been under attack by the authoritarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party. Earlier this year, a powerful businessman and ally of Orban bought half of Index's advertising agency. Protesters took to the streets Friday to defend press freedom.
We came to protest because another independent news portal has fallen victim to Fidesz, and I don't like this. This is why I came. There is hardly any free press left.
In Honduras, protests continue demanding the return of 5 Garifuna land defenders who were kidnapped last week in the northern coastal town of Triunfo de la Cruz. On Saturday, police reportedly began shooting at a crowd of protesters. Garifuna leaders believe the Honduran police and military are involved in the disappearance. This is Miriam Miranda, a Garifuna leader with the group Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras, speaking from her home in Honduras Sunday.
What happened 8 days ago today is the reflection of a systemic persecution and systemic repression, but also a well-crafted plan on behalf of the Honduran state to exterminate the Garifuna community.
In Russia, tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets for the 3rd straight weekend in the far eastern city of Khabarovsk. Demonstrators are calling for President Vladimir Putin to resign and for an end to corruption and economic inequality. In other news from Russia, President Putin said he's arming the Navy with hypersonic nuclear weapons and underwater nuclear drones as fears of a new nuclear arms race have been mounting following Trump's withdrawal from the INF Treaty last year. The Trump administration Friday cleared a major hurdle for the proposed Pebble Mine, a multi-billion-dollar copper and gold mine in Alaska that would be among the world's largest. Environmentalists and local indigenous communities have fought against the proposed mine for nearly 2 decades, saying it would poison their communities and devastate Bristol Bay's salmon fishery. In other environmental news, a group of progressive Democrats, including Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, introduced a bill Friday that would stop fossil fuel companies from receiving billions of taxpayer dollars in subsidies and federal coronavirus relief funds. ProPublica has published the disciplinary records for thousands of New York City police officers, records that were until recently completely sealed off from the public. New York lawmakers voted in June to repeal the controversial 50A law that shielded the records in the wake of George Floyd's killing and amidst the nationwide anti-racist uprising. ProPublica obtained the records from New York City's Civilian Complaint Review Board before a federal judge last week issued a restraining order blocking the city from releasing the data. NYPD unions are suing to prevent the city from making the records public. Florida Congressmember Ted Yoho was forced to resign from his position on the board of a Christian organization amidst the fallout from his verbal attack on Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The organization, Bread for the World, said Yoho's recent actions are, quote, not reflective of our ethical standards. Yoho called Ocasio-Cortez a, quote, effing B-word, but he used the full words, after he accosted her on the steps of Capitol Hill last week. AOC responded to his attack from the House floor, calling out the culture of violence against women in a video that quickly went viral. To see her full address, go to DemocracyNow.org. And Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas has proposed a bill that would cut federal funding to any public school that includes the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project as part of its curriculum. The initiative is named after the year that enslaved Africans were first brought to North America. In an interview with the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Senator Cotton refers to slavery as a, quote, necessary evil upon which the Union was built, unquote. In response, 1619 Project writer Nicole Hannah-Jones tweeted, quote, if chattel slavery, heritable, generational, permanent, race-based slavery, where it was legal to rape, torture, and sell human beings for profit, were a necessary evil, as Tom Cotton says, it's hard to imagine what cannot be justified if it's a means to an end, unquote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. For the 60th day in a row, demonstrators rallied in Portland, Oregon Sunday to protest against police brutality and racism, as well as the deployment of federal forces to the city. Shortly after midnight this morning, federal officers fired tear gas and other so-called less-than-lethal weapons to disperse a crowd that gathered outside the federal courthouse, which has become a flashpoint of the nightly protests. The weekend demonstrations in Portland came days after the Portland City Council unanimously voted to bar Portland police officers from cooperating with federal authorities. On Saturday, federal authorities revealed they had arrested or detained 60 people since being deployed to Portland in early July. Meanwhile, Oregon Congress members Earl Blumenauer and Suzanne Bonamici and about a dozen other lawmakers are demanding the resignation of Chad Wolf, the acting head of the Department of Homeland Security, over his handling of the protests. President Trump's deployment of federal officers to Portland and other cities sparked a new round of protests around the country this weekend. On Thursday, the Trump administration sent a team of federal tactical border officers to Seattle, Washington. In a statement, the Federal Protective Service said, quote, the CBP team will be on standby in the area should they be required. It remains unclear what role the agents played this weekend as Seattle police arrested dozens of protesters and fired flash grenades and pepper spray into crowds. Protesters also took to the streets in other cities, including Oakland, New York, Los Angeles, Louisville, Kentucky, Omaha, Nebraska, Richmond, Virginia, Aurora, Colorado, and Austin, Texas, where a protester named Garrett Foster was shot dead. Foster's mother said her son was pushing his fiance's wheelchair when a car drove into the crowd and opened fire. We begin today's show in Seattle and Portland. In Portland, we're joined by Pastor Edie Mondine, a civil rights activist, president of the Portland, Oregon branch of the NAACP. And in Seattle, Washington, Nikita Oliver is with us, co-executive director of Creative Justice. She's also an artist, attorney, and community organizer with Decriminalize Seattle and King County Equity Now. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Nikita Oliver, let's begin with you. Can you explain what's happening in Seattle right now with President Trump saying, as part of this surge, they've brought federal agents in on, quote, standby? Talk about the protests this weekend and what this means.
Yeah, so this weekend, many people took to the streets, and I want to make sure that we keep the focus on Black lives. You know, ultimately, people are in the streets in defense of Black lives. However, it cannot be ignored that Trump sending federal officers to our city has certainly further emboldened the protests. That being said, you know, we don't know exactly what the federal officers are doing. What we do know is that we are in a situation where local police are welcoming those federal agents into our city. The head of the local police union, the Seattle Police Officers Guild, went on conservative radio about a week ago praising the federal arrest of protesters in Portland and saying it might be time for the feds to come to Seattle. This past weekend, we also saw a renewed violence by Seattle Police Department against protesters. And, they actively have been fighting against a ban on tear gas and rubber bullets that the Seattle City Council imposed. And the Trump Department of Justice essentially backed the Seattle Police Department in lifting that ban. And so we know that in addition to fighting police in our own city, we are also fighting at the federal level against federal enforcements being sent to our city.
Can you talk about how you're protecting yourselves? You tweeted, police are snatching up umbrellas, traffic cones, gas masks from protesters. These are literally protective gear to keep protesters safe from police violence.
Absolutely. A lot of new tactics are being developed in the streets to keep people safe, such as umbrellas, mutual aid networks to disperse protective goggles. People are wearing bike helmets and construction helmets as a way of protecting ourselves from the debris of flashbangs. Even this weekend, we saw Seattle police dropping flashbangs from the top of private roofs. And so people are developing many tactics within the streets to keep each other safe. And I think that is really the important part. People are protecting each other the way that we always have, knowing that when it comes to police violence, we as a community are really what we have as our safety. Street medics are playing a key role and often putting themselves at great personal risk to take care of people on site. But we know that ultimately, the best protection that we're looking for isn't just these tactics that we're developing right now in this moment, but it is an overarching protection against police violence where we have less police. People are staying in the streets in defense of Black lives. And the demand currently on the ground here is to defund SPD by 50% in both the rebalancing package of our city, as COVID-19 has caused a $300 million shortfall, but also in the next upcoming budget as a tactic for decreasing police violence across the board. So while we are developing many tactics on the ground and the street to keep people safe from pepper spray, various CO gas, flashbangs, there's also an overarching work that's happening to how do we keep people safe from police violence across the board.
So, Nikita Oliver, some 5,000 protesters stopped at a youth detention center. Can you talk about the history of that place?
The protests that we're seeing right now are literally built on years of a growing abolitionist movement in the Seattle-King County region. One of the fights that began in 2012 was to stop King County from building a new $244 million youth jail and a new court complex. There was an entire generation of young people, or there is an entire generation of young people since 2012 who have literally come of age fighting the construction of this new youth jail. And it opened earlier this year, and a part of combating state-sanctioned violence over policing police brutality in our city is also acknowledging that the criminal punishment system is deeply attached to policing in Black, Indigenous, and people of color neighborhoods. Last week, very significantly, the King County Executive, Dal Constantine, who was the biggest cheerleader of building the youth jail, announced that in 2025, they will attempt to close the youth jail. There are presently somewhere between 19 and 21 young people being held in cages in that facility. We know that without the groundwork that Black and Native folks have led in our city to stop the building of the youth jail, to stop the building of police bunkers, that the work we're presently doing right now around defunding the police would not have the foundation that it has. When the uprising began this summer, we already had demands ready because we have been, for an extended period of time, fighting this new youth jail. And so two coalitions, Decriminalize Seattle and King County Equity Now, really rose out of that work. So keeping, our sights on that movement of no new youth jail, of closing down youth prisons, but also closing down adult prisons within our region has been a significant part of laying the foundation for this present uprising for Black lives.
I wanted to go to a Portland Black Lives Matter protester addressing the crowd last week.
We pose no threat. The only threat that we pose is sealing the deal on being divided. We will not be divided ever again. We are one nation under God. God bless America. We are the human race. Yes, sir. Black Lives Matter.
Pat, that's a scene from the streets of Portland, Oregon. In addition to Nikita Oliver, we're joined by Pastor Edie Mondane, who is a civil rights activist, president of the Portland, Oregon branch of the NAACP. Recently wrote a piece for the Washington Post titled, "Portland's protests were supposed to be about Black lives. Now they're white spectacle." Can you explain, Pastor?
Well, we're right now in the era that is very serious. We have to embrace the civil rights era with seriousness, and more seriousness than we've done in the 60 years since we've seen it, since its inception. The shallow graves of our clarion criers for justice have now reached the streets of Portland through the stench of tear gas, and rubber bullets. At the core of the Trump administration's actions in Portland are deception. We're at war. The federal government's response is no display of strength, rather it's a deliberate cover-up for Trump's weakness. The president and his allies want this to be a spectacle, be it a naked yogi or the next displaying shocking force of force. They need to be a distraction to the country by engaging our movement into empty battles where there is no advantage. When we engage on their terms, we certainly most definitely lose, but we've got to be able to keep the focus on Black lives. This is not a war. We're not in Beirut. We are in the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world. And we need to understand that this revolution has brought us here to the streets, and it's going to keep us into the streets until we see great movement.
Oregon Senator Ron Wyden talking about the federal agents that Trump has deployed to Portland as essentially fascist. He said, if the line is not drawn in the sand right now, America may be staring down the barrel of martial law in the middle of a presidential election. Do you share that assessment, Pastor Mondane?
Yes, and we can't fall for that deception. We can't settle for martial law. We know where that's going to take us. Listen, it is time now for us to make our voices known and voices heard in the halls of justice. We welcome the protesters. We don't we're not attracted to the violence, but that's all a part of the game. War is deception, and deception is what kills our nation when we're not settled in understanding what truth is and how to divide that truth. We need to be able to march forward with the power that revolution brings, and that tells us that it's time right now for the social change that we're seeking.
Can you talk, I mean, the scenes in the street of Portland, thousands of people, you have a wall of moms and now a wall of dads. You've got that wall of veterans that have lined up as well. Can you talk about the various movements that have come together and what you think is the critical agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement right now?
Well, everyone's seeking to advance justice in Portland. They're facing great danger. And I want to be clear. We welcome our white allies in the street. We welcome the wall of moms. We welcome the leaf-blowing dads. Right now, there are unarmed federal forces kidnapping our citizens off the streets without justification or authority. The mayor of Portland and the governor of Oregon have both asked them to leave, and it's all to no avail. We know that this is a violation of our Constitution, but with President Trump promising only more occupations in more cities, we ignore this risk at our peril. You know, at their core, the Trump administration's actions are really hurting America and not bringing America closer together. But again, the focus has to be on Black lives and Black Lives Matter. It is Black lives and Black Lives Matter that took us to the streets. It is Black lives and Black Lives Matter that keep us in the streets. It's a Black lives issue that keep us downtown nightly in the face of peril and trouble.
Nikita Oliver, what are you demanding of the state right now in Seattle, Washington? And I'll ask the same question of the pastor. I mean, you have, interestingly, the authorities in Oregon, from the governor to the senators to the mayor, Ted Wheeler, who's also the police commissioner, who was tear-gassed himself, vehemently protesting the presence of federal agents. But you also have the local police tear-gassing people. And explain, although they recently, the Portland City Council last week, voted not to cooperate with the federal agents. Explain the situation in Seattle right now.
You know, I want to be very clear that while certainly we are against federal agents being in our city, in our county, we are not fighting for a local monopoly on police violence. We are fighting, and, you know, a huge part, a focus of our movement is we're fighting to defund the police. And very specifically, King County Equity Now and Decriminalize Seattle are fighting to defund the Seattle Police Department. We know that there is no instance in which police actually keep us safe. That, you know, very often when police are called into any situation, they tend to escalate it, or people involved in that situation are sent into the criminal punishment system, which is disproportionately made of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so there are three key demands that have remained at the forefront of our movement and in this fight to defend Black lives. The first is to defund the Seattle Police Department by 50%, starting first with the rebalancing package. And Seattle City Council will have an historical vote on either August 3rd or August 10th, depending on how the process goes, where council members will vote on that 50% package first with the 2020 rebalancing. We have 7 of 9 council members, so this is a veto-proof vote, that have committed to defunding Seattle Police Department by 50%. And there is a strong chance that we will see some defunding on this rebalancing package, but our focus is also very much on the 2021 budget. And those council members are committed to finding those cuts within the Seattle Police Department. But that's only one strategy. The next strategy is knowing that we need a community-based, community-led community safety and public health infrastructure. And so part of the first defund dollars from this 2020 package, from the rebalancing package, should be and will be invested in a participatory budgeting project that will be led by those communities most affected by police terrorism. And that participatory budgeting process will lead us into 2021 to determine how those 50% investments of the current $410 million the Seattle police budget, so that's about $205 million, will be invested in community-based public health and public safety, and we'll invest as soon as possible $10 million in scaling up the current community-based infrastructure. So we have kept a very strong focus on understanding that defunding the police, shrinking the police, is a really important strategy to getting to the place where we don't have police involved in our public health or public safety infrastructure. And then finally, since May 29th, hundreds of protesters have been arrested. And so our movement is calling for all protesters to be freed. No one should be taking a case or a charge by exercising their First Amendment right, especially as it comes to defending Black lives and fighting against state-sanctioned violence.
And what is the role you see of white allies, of other people of color in a Black Lives-led movement?
I believe that our co-conspirators are an essential part of this movement, especially in a region like Seattle, King County. We are about 4% Black community within our city, and so having good, strong allyship, and I use co-conspirator very intentionally. You know, allies are people who may look at your struggle and say, we align with you, we see the value of your life, but that's not necessarily folks who join you in the streets, who will join you in council chambers, who will take a risk of their own lives or their own wealth or their own property in order to join your movement. So in a city like ours, where the Black community has been displaced and gentrified out of the neighborhoods that we have made strong and popular, and in many ways, the Black community has not had access to the immense wealth that has grown in our region. Having those co-conspirators is essential in the streets, but also in many of our political strategies. What I will say is this current uprising is the first time that we have seen a considerable amount of our white allies and white co-conspirators take to the streets in a sustained movement. For the past 60 days, we have seen thousands upon thousands of people in Seattle consistently protesting, consistently rallying, and consistently focusing on the three demands that the Black liberation movement here in our city and our region has brought to the surface. And so it really is essential that we have that co-conspirator movement happening at the same time, while simultaneously recognizing that no movement is successful without a diversity of tactics. We know historically we've had to see a diversity of tactics put in place in order to win, in order for movements to remain strong. And so we are also seeing that happening on the ground here, from movements in the streets to movements in council chambers to movements of educators and people all over our city, in order to ensure that the movement in defense of Black lives is present in every aspect of our movement work.
And Pastor Edie Mondene, you have this massive, sustained protest movement in Portland, which is the whitest large city in this country, the whitest of the 35 largest cities. The New York Times wrote the state was founded on principles of white supremacy. A 19th century lash law called for whipping any Black person found in the state. In the early part of the 20th century, Oregon's legislature was dominated by members of the Ku Klux Klan. And you have a very interesting piece in the Atlantic that said, that talks about the 13th, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Oregon's laws preventing Black people from living in the state and owning property were superseded by national law, but Oregon itself didn't ratify the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, until 1973. This history, to say the least, resulting in a very white state. What you want to see happen now?
Well, I am thrilled that we're seeing so many new members come out to join us as allies. And just as my sister spoke, the allies will go with you to the gate, but they become accomplices when they go out into the streets with us, when they join us in our fight. In the fight for restorative racial justice in our different roles, we'll walk together through this battlefield. Wherever it goes and wherever it takes us, and however it fulfills those efforts that we're trying to obtain, Black Lives Mattering, and not being 3/5 human. In this battle, some of us will find our greatest call to service in helping open the gates and guard those perimeters that Black people deserve to live in. Again, this is the only state in the nation that was incepted in racism. There is a place for all of us here. We are in a historic time in America, a time that we'll never see again. And the reality of the everyday Black existence has been promoted to the greater public's consciousness. We have woke up in this country. We are awakened now, and we're awakened by the sound of, again, those clarion criers that were killed in the 60s. Their blood is calling from the mud, and they're saying it's time for justice, it's time for change.
Pastor Edie Mondene, I want to thank you for being with us, president of the Portland, Oregon NAACP, joining us from Portland, and Nikita Oliver of Creative Justice and Decriminalize Seattle, joining us from Seattle. Next up, as John Lewis is buried this week, we remember the civil rights icon and speak with Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude about his legacy, about Black Lives Matter, and about his new book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own.
Full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun. thou who has brought us thus far.
Music from Congressmember John Lewis's memorial service in Selma, Alabama over the weekend. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. 55 years ago, Alabama state troopers brutally beat John Lewis and hundreds of others who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Bloody Sunday, to demand the right to vote. On Sunday, the body of John Lewis crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the final time. Rose petals were scattered along the path as two black horses pulled a caisson, the casket of the late civil rights icon and 17-term Georgia congressman who died on July 17th at the age of 80. The carriage driver wore a white face mask to guard against the spread of coronavirus and a black top hat, which he took off and placed over his heart when he reached the top of the bridge and paused for 2 minutes over the Alabama River. The day before, Congressmember Lewis was remembered in services in his hometown of Troy, Alabama. One service at Troy University was titled "The Boy from Troy," the nickname Dr. Martin Luther King gave Lewis at their first meeting in 1958 in Montgomery. John Lewis was denied admission to the school in 1957 because he was black. Decades later, he was awarded an honorary degree. After Sunday's ceremony in Selma, John Lewis's body was taken to the Alabama Capitol to lie in state. He will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., before a private funeral Thursday after he lies in state in the Georgia State Capitol. The funeral will take place at the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, once led by King. In 2012, Congressmember John Lewis came to the Democracy Now! Studio and talked about what happened on that day in March, that day known as Bloody Sunday.
I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. My legs went out from under me. I felt like I was going to die. I thought I saw death. All these many years later, I don't recall how I made it back across that bridge to the church. But after I got back to the church is full to capacity. More than 2,000 people on the outside trying to get in to protest what had happened on the bridge. And someone asked me to say something to the audience. And I stood up and said something like, I don't understand it, how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam, but cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama, to protect people who only desire to register to vote. The next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to a local hospital in Selma.
That was the late civil rights icon John Lewis speaking at Democracy Now! To see the whole hour, go to democracynow.org. The bravery John Lewis and others showed in the face of the police violence that day played a key role in passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act just 2 months later. He would go on to be arrested some 40 times during the civil rights movement and many times after that, making what he called good trouble. For more on his legacy, on the movement today of Black Lives Matter, we go to Professor Eddie Glaude, the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, author of a new book, well, his old, called Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and his new book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Professor Glaude, welcome back to Democracy Now! This is the week of John Lewis, as he will lay in state in 3 different capitals, Alabama, Georgia, and in Washington, D.C., and then be buried on Thursday. He was not only a 17-term Congress member, he also was the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He came out of movements. He marched in the streets. He was beaten and arrested numerous times. Talk about the significance of this.
You know, whenever I think of John Lewis, I think about his fundamental faith, his fundamental commitment that human beings could be otherwise. He writes that faith is being so sure of what the Spirit has whispered in one's heart that your belief in it is unshakable, in its individuality is unshakable. John Lewis demonstrated a courage that was rooted in his faith. But I think it's important, Amy, that when we tell the story of John Lewis, we understand that he comes out of the student movement. And we're going to connect this to the earlier segment with what's going on with Black Lives Matter. He comes out of the student movement, those young folk who set in, who radicalized in some significant way the civil rights movement, those students between 15, 16, 17, and 22 years old, some 23 years old. And so in Nashville, right, as he was going to school, trained under Jim Lawson, he was a part of that wildfire of sit-ins that shook the nation and then organized itself at Shaw University as Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with SNCC and Marion Barry and Muriel Tillinghast and Stokely Carmichael and Chuck McDew and Cortland Cox. These are Diane Nash. These are these young students who became the shock troops of the movement, who went into the bowels of the South, sometimes only 2, 3, 4 deep, and risked everything. In literature, we might call them the holy fools, who risked their lives to change the nation. And I think it's really important that when we tell the story of John Lewis, that we don't simply yoke him to Dr. King, which is important. We understand him as a product of this student activism. And remember, at the March on Washington, Amy, they had Archbishop O'Boyle tried to censor his speech. In some ways, they were successful, him and others, right? And what they said, that famous quote that people have been using over and over again about patience, in the original version of that speech, John Lewis said patience is a nasty and dirty word. So there is more to be said about his legacy and about the movement that he came out of.
And when you say he was not only tied to Dr. King, on Democracy Now! He talked about meeting with Malcolm in Africa, in Nairobi, and spending several days with him. In fact, actually, Malcolm X was in Selma. And also, when he marched, when he had his head bashed in, Dr. King wasn't next to him then. He went later for the later march, but he wasn't there then. That was led by John Lewis.
Right, and it's important to understand, we tell the story of Selma as this high point, and it was. You were right to note that it laid the foundation for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but Selma was a moment of extraordinary conflict. John Lewis marched in that march without the sanction of SNCC. He could not be a representative of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee because SNCC disagreed with the strategy of SCLC. In that moment, you've already mentioned, Malcolm was present. SNCC organizers were challenging the basic strategy. Remember, they end up in Lowndes County, Alabama, organizing what would become, in some ways, the first iteration of the Black Panther Party. A year later, Stokely Carmichael will declare that he's no longer going to say freedom now, he's going to say Black power. John Lewis was chair of SNCC from 1963 to 1966. He, in effect, was in some ways a leader of the radicalization of this student organization. And it broke his heart, Amy, that he lost to Stokely Carmichael as chairperson, that he had to walk away. But it had something to do with his commitment to the philosophy of nonviolence. And let me say this really quickly. We often tell the story of Black power and the civil rights movement as if they're wholly separate. When we look at SNCC, and we look at the life of John Lewis, we see that many of the people who cried Black power were some of the same young people who risked their lives nonviolently in the bowels of the South. They confronted the terror of the country, the betrayal of the country, and their anger bubbled over. They sought power as an answer to the moral question. John Lewis's faith never shook, though. It never changed. And that's why he, to this day, believes in nonviolence. And that's why he's going to his grave as, in some ways, a martyr of that particular philosophy.
We're going to break and then talk about a man that you also wrote about. At that time, also a contemporary, actually, of John Lewis, and that's James Baldwin. Because in 1963, 2 years before Bloody Sunday, when John Lewis was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, it wasn't a few weeks before the bombing of the Birmingham church to show the stakes and the killing of these little girls. We're going to talk about the civil rights movement right up through this election. We're talking to Professor Eddie Glaude. We'll continue with him in 30 seconds.
Let me know if you buy it and you down to rise, yeah. I've been down and out in bondage and we bonded out. This ain't buying the cloud of crime will be divided. Ain't too proud to be beside you in the sirens. Let me know if you buy it when you down to ride. I've been down and out in bondage and we bonded out. There ain't buying the cloud of crime will be divided. Ain't too proud to be
This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman, The Quarantine Report. We're speaking with Professor Eddie Glaude, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. His new book, just out, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. This is James Baldwin speaking in 1963 about federally backed urban renewal programs.
A boy last week, who was 16 in San Francisco, told me on television, thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now, he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or, some abstraction called the Negro problem. These are Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says and don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
That's James Baldwin in 1963. 1963 was also the year, as I said, of the Birmingham church bombing, 4 little girls killed. James Baldwin giving fiery addresses about what this meant. He would eventually leave the United States. Professor Eddie Glaude, he has been the backdrop of your life. Talk about what he represented then and what it means for today.
Well, I've been thinking about James Baldwin for about 30 years. He's been in my spirit, in my head, at the foundation of my scholarly career in some ways. And what I wanted to do was to think about him as this poet who spoke the truth to our times. And, Amy, he had to come to terms with the fact that the country turned its back on the Black freedom struggle. He had to come to terms with the fact that the nation, in effect, assassinated Dr. King. And he collapsed after 1968, and he had to pick up the pieces. So what I wanted to do was to walk with James Baldwin as he, in some ways, grappled with his moment of betrayal and find resources for us in our moment as we're grappling with our own moment of betrayal. And what I've learned is that he spoke truth. He spoke truth. He insisted that the nation confront the lie, the illusions that protect its so-called innocence. And that became the basis of writing this book in this moment in which Trumpism overdetermined so much of our lives.
And what does he have to, why did he leave America? Talk about that. And also, what does he teach us about today in this election that we just spoke to Noam Chomsky, says that's the most important election in human history right now, here in the United States, in the most powerful country in the world.
Right. So in 1940, he left the U.S. in 1948 because he had to get away. He said the hatred was taking root in him, and either he was going to kill somebody or he was going to be killed. And so he left Harlem and went to Paris. And there he engaged in this extraordinary act of self-creation where he willed himself into being a writer, but he had to do it outside of the country so he could at least breathe, so he could find the space to imagine himself otherwise, to deal with what was deposited in his gut. And it's precisely, I think, the Baldwin as witness, Baldwin as someone who tried to make real the suffering, that is the lesson we need to learn today. He insisted, Amy, that we tell the truth about who we are and what we've done, that we put aside the myths and illusions and understand what white supremacy has done in terms of disfiguring and distorting the character of this nation. In this moment, we have the forces of authoritarianism clashing with the forces of democracy. In this moment, we have the nation trying to confront what will it be? And the question is, will it double down on its ugliness? Will white folks simply double down on being white folk again? And do we have to deal with another generation, my son and his children, having to deal with the implication and the consequence of that dastardly and ghastly decision to be white?
So you call the book Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. Take it forward to now.
Well, I get the title from his last novel, Just Above My Head, and I paraphrase here. He says, when the dream was shattered, people scattered. Some lost their minds, some went to jail, some left the country, but we know what we did. And he says, responsibility isn't lost. Responsibility is abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, then one begins again. And at the end of his 1972 important book, No Name in the Street, he likens us to midwives trying to give birth to a new American. And every time, Amy, every time we are at this moment where we can give birth to a different way of being in this country, a different multiracial America, the umbilical cord of white supremacy is wrapped around the baby's neck, and it chokes the life out of it. So here we are in this moment once again. Our responsibility, if we don't abdicate it, is to try to give birth to a genuinely multiracial democracy. I think if we fail this time, I'm not so sure the country will survive. But that's what's in our hands in this moment, in nobody else's hands. It's in ours.
Also, his bravery in speaking out as a Black queer man in America and then leaving this country.
Yeah. I interviewed Angela Davis right here in Princeton, and she said in so many ways he was alone. He said, you know, when he wrote Giovanni's Room, he said, you couldn't hold my sexuality over me. I told you. And the courage of this vulnerable, frail man to speak truth to power no matter the consequences, right? And I think he in some ways is an exemplar for us. What does it mean to hold true and steadfast to our convictions and not take the bribe? Because when James Baldwin understood, when he embraced those young people who cried Black power, he understood the cost. He knew what would happen to his career. And so the book, Amy, focuses on the latter part of James Baldwin's career, not the early part. And I think we need to understand the cost and be willing to take the risks.
About those risks and what this election means right now, your assessment of President Trump.
Oh, he's a disaster. You know, I was on your show debating Michael Eric Dyson, if you recall, about the 2016 election. And I said I wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And, you know, I was thinking about this. And, you know, in some ways, I overestimated white America. I didn't think they would elect someone who was so clearly unqualified to be the leader of the country. But the mandate of Donald Trump is clear. Line the pockets of the oligarchs and make America white again. So we have to do two things in this moment. We have to get him out of office, and we have to push a vision for a complete reimagining of American life. We have to put forward a radical vision of this country, something like what Nikita Oliver put forward in the last segment. We have to do both things simultaneously. It's not an either or. So I learned my lesson. Sometimes, as Jimmy Baldwin said in 1979, when faced with the election of Ronald Reagan and perhaps the first neoliberal president in the United States, Jimmy Carter, he says sometimes voting for Black America is just simply a matter of buying some time. We need to understand our choices, but we need to get Donald Trump out of office, and we need to put forward a radical vision of America moving forward.
And President Trump hanging now on to these toppled Confederate generals, the significance of this, moving in federal troops to American cities, and doing this all during the time of COVID, which disproportionately affects communities of color.
You know, we've been risking our lives ever since folk brought us here. And so we see folks risking their lives in the midst of this global pandemic to call attention to what police are doing to us daily. Donald Trump is in the midst of reasserting the lie. At every moment, at every time in which the nation faces a kind of moral reckoning, there's a reassertion of the lie. And that lie is the belief that America is the shining city on the hill. That lie is the belief that Black folk don't really have the capacity to really take on the real serious burdens of citizenship. That lie is rooted, Amy, in this idea that racial justice is a philanthropic enterprise, right? And so what we're seeing in this moment is not only the energies of everyday ordinary people, we see clearly Donald Trump trying to reassert the lie that America is a white nation in the vein of old Europe.
Princeton University professor Eddie Glaude, his new book is Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and its urgent lessons for our own. That does it for our broadcast. Stay safe, save lives, wear a mask.